Hi, Kirby.
Hi.
So maybe the best way to start, you tell a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do.
Sure. My name is Kirby Brady, and I am just about almost native San Diegan, so that's part of my personal story. But my parents and I were born in New Orleans, and we moved to San Diego when I was about 2. So I've been in San Diego and have had my one foot in, one foot out here in the South, going back and forth for a lot of my life. And so here in San Diego, as an adult, my career has really been in and around government. I've worked for local government for a number of years, both at the regional level for Sandag, and then now for the city. And in between that, working for the Economic Development Corporation. So really, my focus, regardless of the organization I've been working for, has always been around kind of civic issues, regional governance, policy, how decisions are made. So that's really sort of where my heart lies, is in making my community better. I have a background in urban planning. That was what I did my graduate work in at USC. And so again, even though I've made it to more of a policy world, it's really about how, my experiences, my career has been about how people interact with the place in which they live, how government can meet their needs. And so, that's a big part of who I am, really, is the place that I'm in and wanting to do right by my city. So
Let me ask you this, and I think you and I talked a little bit about that before, but why do you think it's so hard to talk about race in America these days?
yeah, I think it's really hard to talk about race. The most obvious thing is because it's something that is, makes us different from one another in one sense. It's uncomfortable. I think most, here I'll narrow my thoughts to what I'm experiencing in this country, but we have a very difficult history and legacy, with issues around race and racism in this country for hundreds of years at this point. And so I think it's generally people don't like to talk about things that make them uncomfortable. And I think racism is one of those things, and race, that, confronting differences and knowing that it's usually some contentious points of view. I think that's what makes it difficult for people, is, again, and a lot of people, in my experience, people are generally, I would say for the most part, you know, people are not confrontational, and they don't want to tread into waters that they're not comfortable in discussing. And so I definitely think that race has always been just one of those subjects that even outwardly it's very apparent that you and I look very different. The lived experiences are different, and I think people have a hard time sort of going deep on that.
Yeah, and that's the experience that I definitely want to talk more about. But it's interesting that when I spoke to Hilda yesterday, and we spoke about similar topic in terms of how people don't want to be uncomfortable, yet it's important to get uncomfortable if you want to change anything. Because
That's right.
if we're all complacent, it's really hard to make a difference.
Right.
It's only when we feel uncomfortable then we start to changing something, and that's part of the reason why I think we want to have these conversations and try to understand each other. Going back to the experiences that you mentioned, what have been your experiences, both like growing up, and what is it like for you to be Black in America?
Yeah, I think, I've had the benefit of traveling both, domestically and internationally, and knowing that that carries with it, different experiences in different places, different context. But it's been interesting for me personally, just growing up in San Diego, but also having the experiences of traveling to the South and having family there, and even in the U.S., obviously geographically, regionally, how race plays into your everyday experience, I think, is very different. And so, in San Diego, my earliest memories are here in San Diego, and the West Coast being a little bit more liberal, probably in a lot of ways more tolerant, I would say, um, at least overtly. My experience, didn't really, growing up. Race wasn't. It was a thing. You acknowledge that you're different in some way, but it wasn't really something that was the focus for me or for anyone around me. And I can say that also having gone to, a very small private prep school here in San Diego, where a lot of my peers, immediately surrounding me were white, some Hispanic, and far fewer of them were Black. But again, it was, a very kind of tolerant, situation where, some of my best friends here in San Diego are all different colors of the rainbow. And so, it wasn't until I got a little bit older and had the experience of traveling to other places. So again, being born in New Orleans and experiencing very different scenarios in the South, where, from even the way you experience your physical environment in a place like New Orleans, where it's very segregated. So again, just the housing patterns, the way people interact with their city, places like the French Quarter, where you don't really see too many locals, if you will. It's mostly tourists, but also, getting stares, older, more recently, taking my husband back to New Orleans, and he's Hispanic and very, very light skinned. And, people outwardly, just the hateful comments that you get, being called a race traitor on one hand, getting the sideways looks on the other, and then remembering that not too long ago, it was still technically illegal for people to be married from different races. So, my experiences, I think, now as an adult, what I'm experiencing more in San Diego is when you know what to look for, kind of the subtle microaggressions. Racism can be very overt. The outward displays of hatred, we're seeing that right now across the country with some of the recent kind of unrest that we're seeing as a result of kind of inequities and police brutality, outright hatred for one another. But, on a daily basis in a place like California or a place like San Diego, more specifically, it's kind of these microaggressions in the workplace. And so for me, that's been things like, hearing from people that after I've been in a room and maybe I present differently than they expect, or whatever their expectations may have been, the small things like, oh, you're very articulate, where can I ask, what you studied or where you went to, and not in a, I think there's small things that we want to know about each other, but these are sometimes the first things that I'm confronted with is, more of the, what are your qualifications? Maybe, this you can kind of pick up on or detect, a hint of suspicion or disbelief. And it's more like, what have I done to earn my place in that room, if you will? So, a lot of what I experience now, it's very subtle. But I'm also not incredibly caught off guard, or I should say I'm just frankly used to be in San Diego, I'm used to being sometimes the only person of color in a room, with decision makers, with elected officials. And so part of my experience is just recognizing that, we need things to change, and we want representation and a government and leaders that really reflect the community as well. And so, my experience with race evolves the older I get. Like, it's a direct relationship with who I am and how the world perceives me, and it continues to evolve. So
I wanted to kind of drill down on a couple of things that you said. So one was about those encounters and conference rooms and meetings where, if I understand you correctly, it's basically as if people already had certain preconceived notions about you, and you kind of exceeded their expectations, and then they're getting curious and asking, is that what you're alluding to?
yeah, or and sometimes it can be a little bit more overt than that, but yeah, it's more, two things. I mean, just recognizing the obvious is that I think there's always the thought for some people that I'm younger than I am. So that's part of it too. Just maybe recognizing that I might look a little bit younger than some of the people in the room. But yeah, people wanting to know kind of my credentials, if you will. But I've also been up to the flip side. It's been a little bit more direct, where I can tell you, this has happened to me more than once, where I have been in a room with a bunch of people who don't look like me, and kind of a slip of the tongue, which is, Kirby, this is one direct experience I had working in a local government, where someone basically said, well, yeah, Kirby here, she's great. She does X, Y, and Z for us. But also, we're just proving that we're not just a bunch of old white guys. And so, that stings a little bit, because
Yeah.
I'd like to think that I'm not just someone's not just playing like the diversity card when
Yeah.
I'm being invited to a meeting, or I'm being invited to participate or speak on a panel. And then I would say, honestly, I've been in those rooms where it's clear sometimes that that's the reason that I'm there, or I'm there to round out an agenda because they needed a woman and bonus points if you're Black. So, yeah,
And
those are some experiences I've had.
how often does that happen?
um, I'd say it's probably it's probably the exception to have someone slip up and kind of misspeak and make it the focus of call it out and for what it is. But I would say that happens probably a couple times a year where you can just tell if you're the last person to make it onto the agenda for something, or maybe what they're asking you to speak about is a little bit outside your wheelhouse. They're really grasping for straws, and they know that they have to have the representation. But in thinking about that, I also, we're at a place where, to be fair, people need to be aware that representation does matter. And I think it's hard, right? It's like you don't want to be there. I don't want to be in any room only because of the fact that I'm Black. I'd like to think that I earned my place there, but at the same time, people know that they have to have diversity, right? So it's kind of like in a little bit of a catch-22. Like in my mind, I'm always questioning why I'm there. And it could be because people really believe in me and my message and what I bring to the table. And it could be because they need someone that looks like me. So, it's just, those are the things that I would say that's a personal experience as a person of color that in the back of my mind, kind of always chewing on. And sometimes, very clear which way, which way people are headed with that.
And how's that make you feel?
Um, Again, I think personally, I'm always conflicted because again, it's me personally, I feel like I've worked as hard to get to a place where I've earned my right to be in rooms like that. And, my parents have always said that, from the time I could remember, the conversations that I've had with them have been around the fact that I can do whatever I want to do. You grow up, you work hard, you study hard. You can do anything you want to do, but knowing that you have to hold yourself to I've had to hold myself to a higher standard than people just because of the color of my skin. And that was painted by their experiences coming up, obviously in the 50s and 60s. So a very different time, but it makes me feel like, on the one hand, again, like I want to think that I've earned that place, but on the other hand, I always question sometimes the motives or the intentions. But I do, again, I feel the conflicting part is I know that people have to be aware of where we're at and aware of society and aware of, how we make progress. And that does include being mindful of what your participation and your representation looks like, whether it's on your board, whether it's, around the room, for a funding or a grant meeting, whether it's in your board, so it doesn't quite, throughout the spectrum of kind of the world of work and professionalism, like people have to be aware of it to call it out and to make progress. But then to be on the receiving end of it, I'm always wondering why. So it's nuanced. I could say this is the best way I can put it.
I think this is really important to understand, because I'm not sure a lot of people understand it on the other end. That's what's going on. And with all the best intentions, I've been mentioning it before, like when I moved to Germany as a Russian immigrant, and one of the jobs, I was working for a management consulting company, and I remember my boss once told me, "You're really smart for a Russian." And
that's overt.
yeah, I know she was trying to make a compliment, but I
Yeah.
wasn't so sure, And
Yeah.
that's like, okay, we look the same. We had the same skin color, but I had a different accent and I was from a different background. So, so that's kind of like what it felt a little bit odd, to put it mildly. But one thing I wanted to go back to is talk about your parents and talk about your family and you growing up. Maybe you tell a little bit more about your parents and why did they decide to move to San Diego from New Orleans? Maybe a little bit more about their background.
Yeah. So my parents are wonderful people, I should say. just for the record, in case they ever see this. I love them very much. But no, they grew up in New Orleans in a time, you know, coming in at a young age, both of them obviously experiencing going through the civil rights movement. And again, the South being a very different place, where you are, you know, in some ways at that time severely, you know, limited in terms of your economic outlook, just based off of the zip code that you've grown up in or the color of your skin. And some of that obviously perpetuates and is present today. But you know, they both lived, coming out of the Ninth Ward in New Orleans, which is, you know, achieved some fame, I guess, some degree of, I don't know, but it's notable. And so it wasn't an easy childhood. It wasn't a good place to be. A lot of poverty, a lot of crime, a lot of violence. And you know, thankfully my dad at least had some family members around him who, you know, it's hard to know, dream big and dream of what's possible if no one around you is modeling that. So if you live in the ghetto and nobody else makes it out of the ghetto, you don't know what's beyond sort of your small corner of the world. But my dad had a little bit of exposure and some relatives who really wanted to protect him and, you know, were invested in him making something of himself and becoming successful. And so he, in his case, had an older brother, my uncle, who kind of made it out, kind of established himself on the West Coast, ended up going on to get his PhD. And, you know, all these things happen a little bit later when you're just trying to get by. So my parents, you know, as soon as you graduate from high school and you're in poverty, you go to work. Like, college isn't a real thing for a lot of people. You don't know how you're going to pay for it. You need to just make ends meet and get by. So my parents, you know, they were doing that as they were younger. When, you know, a lot of us are going off to college at 18, 19 years old, they were working full time and working even before most people have, you know, some jobs before they even graduate from high school. And so it was a really tough upbringing. But again, my dad, some of this comes down to, I think, sheer grit and determination. Just knew that he wanted a better life for himself and wanted to get out. So worked very hard, went to community college there while working full time as well. Met my mom, they got married. And then at some point he made the decision that he wanted to come out to the West Coast, had heard that it was a better place. He didn't have much experience traveling. I should mention he had a brief stint in the Navy in there too. So I think you get a little bit more life experience there. And made it to the West Coast to do some more schooling. My parents went to college later, in their, you know, late 20s. And, you know, they ended up staying out here. And my dad kind of got his footing here. And he's always spent his whole career in healthcare management. So really worked his way up from an orderly in the hospitals all the way to CEO. And that's actually what brought them to San Diego, is that he became the CEO of a hospital here in the 90s. And so, you know, in my opinion, it's a pretty incredible story when you're able to sort of make it out of abject poverty like that, with very little resources, with very little support. So, you know, that was, again, kind of to your point, you know, the lessons I received growing up, some of them didn't really resonate with me when I was young.
Like what?
So when I said that my parents were, you know, telling me that I've got to work harder, be smarter, speak better, hold myself to those higher standards than other people just because I was Black, that didn't make sense to me then also growing up in San Diego, because we were in a different time. We were in a different place. The world was different. Racism, you know, at that point, my lived experience coming up as a kid in San Diego was very different than what they experienced in New Orleans in the 50s and the 60s. And so, you know, I didn't quite, those things kind of took root in my head somewhere, but it wasn't until I was much older that I understood, you know, their frame of reference and the ways in which the world was working, where they were basically telling me, hey, you can do anything that you want to do, but you need to do things a little bit differently. You need to be a little bit more cautious and strategic, because people will judge you based off of one thing only, and that is the way that you look. And so, you know, again, they have an interesting story, and one generation later, my story is very different. But with everything that's happening in the world, I see probably some parallels between what they experienced going through the civil rights movement and then what we're experiencing in present day, where people are still in a lot of ways fighting for some of the same things. Basic issues around economic security, economic justice, equality, social justice, fighting against police brutality. So it's really interesting to watch it come kind of full circle. And even from their perspective, having lived through that in the 60s, them drawing those parallels and saying it's unfortunate that we're finding ourselves back in a really dark place in the present day.
The things that they've been telling you, that you need to work harder and be smarter and so on and so on. Were there any kind of warnings that they shared with you, or any stories that they shared with you and said, in some situation you need to be more careful, or anything like that?
Yeah. Not in like I'm thinking about, probably I don't have any brothers. I have an older sister. And I'm thinking when you're saying that, some of the life advice that particularly young Black men are given just about conducting themselves in public, and the fact that people might be afraid of them. I wouldn't say it was as much of that, but just more, again, you need to be on good behavior. You're going to be under a microscope in a lot of ways. And I went to a small school where I was one of the few people of color. And I do feel like in some ways, that school that I went to, you'd notice a little bit different treatment. And in my instance, I would say it was minor. It's like, why am I getting detention for these really minor infractions and like the next guy isn't? Why am I always like, getting called out for? And it's almost like it's in the education system too. And I, thankfully didn't experience it to a degree that a lot of young men and women do across the country. But even in a prep school, it was like, you feel like you're different. You know that you're different in some ways. And sometimes you do feel like the school system and educators take kind of sort of punitive measures against you and treat you a little bit differently because they may have preconceived notions about what it means to have, a Black kid in the classroom. And, the expectations are a little bit different. So, I think for me, it was a little bit different. They put me in a system where they wanted me to succeed and could, were in the position to pay for me to have a very quality education. But you still feel the little, remark. You hear the small remarks here, or the little notes you get sent home there about stuff. And there were times where my parents were like, they can suss it out. They're like, this is real, and you've been acting out, and you need to settle down. Or like, we know that it's clear from our parent teacher conferences with so and so, or this educator, that like they probably have an issue that has nothing to do with you. It's probably the way that you look. So it's a mixed bag, but I've gotten some advice from them around behavior particularly. So
Can you think of any stories, any particular stories that happened at school that kind of were the most that stayed with you the most, maybe?
Yeah, and this isn't about this one. I have a great one, and this may take our chat in a little bit different of a direction, but this isn't about being disciplined per se, but this was about an interaction that I had with one of my classmates, actually two of my classmates, and the setting was we were in a party doing what high school kids do and thinking that their parents aren't knowing that they may be out drinking or they may be out. And, this young man who was someone in my graduating class, we got into a spirited discussion about colleges. It was senior year where everyone's, amped for the college admission process, and we're eagerly awaiting all of our acceptance letters. And I don't remember how we ended up arguing over something, but we ended up arguing. And, he made a comment to the effect of, actually his direct words were, well, it must be nice to know that you're only going to get into college because you're Black. And this is someone that I spent all 4 years of high school with. Wouldn't have considered this person to be racist in any stretch of the imagination. But, I think this is a separate issue in that I understand in a lot of ways sort of where we're at today as a society and kind of this resurgence of hate. And maybe some of these things have been sort of bubbling under the surface. And it's just, we have the right conditions to sort of bring these things to light. But with this particular gentleman, I think the issue is the fact that we don't have a good enough understanding as a society of where we've come from historically. Really the struggle around civil rights, and even before that, the movement, even the basic, struggles of this nation, our identity. A war was fought over some of these issues. And, for him to say something like that, it just speaks to the fact that a lot of people aren't aware of some of the true root causes of these disparities that are plaguing our society around kind of systemic racism, how it's built into, banking practices, lending practices, the housing system. And so, for us to get to this point where, he's telling me that I check a box and all of a sudden I'm, making it into college, and there's a bigger issue there, right, with affirmative action. But like, for people not to understand fundamentally why there was a policy such as affirmative action in place in the first place, that we're kind of back to that same point where people look at a whole group of people, in this case, maybe Black people, and say, like, if you could just pull yourself up by the bootstraps and just do better and don't piss off the police, that you would be in a better place economically. Like, it's infuriating. And so again, this goes back to, in my opinion, like the terrible, terrible understanding of race in America. To your first question about why it's so uncomfortable to talk about, is because there are hard truths that people just are not willing to accept, which is that decisions that have been made, in this case, legacy institutions, policies, the formation of this great nation dating back hundreds of years at this point, have led to, reinforcement and systemically kind of contributed to present state. People don't understand that, and that's kind of where we're at. So that's a good one personal story that I can share with you that gives you some insight, even to the people that present themselves as allies or people that are saying they're not racist. You have to do more than just like not like someone because they're Black to be, you need to be anti-racist, and we need to start dismantling these systems. Like, so there's a lot there, but
to me, the comments like this, it sounds like jealousy of a person not understanding how hard it is for Black people to get ahead in a lot of circumstances.
That's right.
How much harder it is in general.
That's right.
They think it's easier for you because of affirmative action, and it's very very frustrating when people say things like that. So then you went to USC, right?
I did, yeah, for grad school.
So what was it like in LA?
I mean, yeah, LA is two things. One, I think anyone who's been to LA knows that it's basically impossible to get around during normal hours of the day because traffic is so bad. So for the couple years, 2 years, I don't really feel is a real good representative experience of probably how people who live there for longer periods feel. But, I experienced it as just any large metropolitan city. And I was there or metropolitan area, and I was there for just grad school, mostly in and around campus. I, never really made it out too far. Didn't spend the weekends exploring LA. I spent a lot more time coming home to San Diego because San Diego is hands down 1,000 times over a much better city than Los Angeles. That's the native San Diegan in me. So, my experience there was fine. And
I can agree with that.
It was the same thing, being in a campus environment that, for the most part, USC, another place of privilege, if you will. My experience there was fine, but college campuses obviously are places where you've got hopefully a little bit more diversity and innovative thinking and a little bit more open-minded. So I had a wonderful experience going to school there, and obviously it shaped the way I view the world coming from a planning background. But my experience in LA was, I would say, unremarkable.
All right. Unremarkable is good. Cool. So I think I wanted to touch on something that you said before when you were talking about like not having brothers and having an older sister. I think there's a lot of conversation about what it's like to be a Black man, and there's not a lot of conversation. At least I didn't hear a lot of conversation about what it's like to be a Black woman, and what is the different experience for women, and maybe it's not so much about, as you said, about warning you, like how do you behave around police, or but there's got to be something else. How would you describe that?
I think that it's hard in a lot of, I think there are a few tangible things I can point to, but I think most people, or I shouldn't say most people, some people may be aware of the fact that, school age children, Black boys and Black girls are treated differently in the educational system. We've talked a little bit about that. I think there's this problem where Black children are seen as a lot of times more mature. And I know that there are studies out there that speak to this, that Black children are perceived as older and more mature than they really are. And they don't have the same treatment when it comes to sort of punishment, whether it's in school, whether it's in the legal system. So, I mean, as a Black woman, I think there's always, again, even though my experiences probably are different, a lot different from young Black men, in the sense that I don't think people are fearful of me. I hope they're not. It's the do I receive different treatment, harsher treatment? Am I perceived as something other than I am? Angry is a big one. So, I think we've all heard the trope, the angry Black woman. And so that's something, that's a real one where, I'm always trying to walk a fine line of being, professional, diplomatic, very careful with my words, because I've heard people refer to other women as that. Oh, you're just the angry Black woman. Like, I've got some axe to grind. I'm just mad. Maybe that's not one you're familiar with. That's a big one. And so I'm always careful about that, because if I'm, delivering any kind of, critiques or, anything that, you're just not chipper, like you're serious in any way, I'm always concerned that I'm going to be perceived as being hostile. And that's, again, less about me out in sort of the wide world, but more like in the workplace is how Black women are perceived. And that's a sensitive area for me, because I think it's hard. People want you to be, oh yeah, great, that's wonderful. And sometimes it's like, I'm going to be real with you. And, I'm hoping that people aren't interpreting, my directness or my seriousness in a certain way, just because they have this preconceived notion that I'm just an angry Black woman. So that's a big one. That's a really big one that I'm thinking about on a daily basis, especially in the kind of higher up you get in positions of leadership or influence. And so, being younger and Black and in a leadership structure here at the city where there are not a ton of people that look like me yet. I'm hopeful for a future where all of our leadership is more reflective of the demographics of the population. But right now I'm always trying to be very careful, because I don't want to be interpreted the wrong way when I'm in those rooms, especially now when people are having some of these harder discussions, especially now about race, about injustice. And so I don't want to be the militant person in there that's like, yeah. So it's tough, but that's the truth.
Let's talk a little bit about affirmative action. And do you think it's solving the problem, or do you think a different approach is needed? How do you feel about affirmative action?
I think I feel the way I feel about affirmative action is the way I feel about a lot of policies, where maybe the intentions are good, and how it actually plays out in reality. These things policies aren't made, they shouldn't be made to be set in stone, unchanging. But I certainly agree with the spirit of it, which is that, it's recognizing that we don't have a level playing field. It attempted to sort of kind of rectify that and say that we're not starting from places of sort of equal footing. And I hate the expression giving people a leg up, because it's, in my opinion, that almost implies that, it's out of the goodness of your heart. And it's like, I just want to help. And that's not what it is. It's that, to your point, it's, if we're all racing to the same finish line, in this case, maybe, graduating from college, getting a higher education. How do you expect people to have a fair shot when maybe their starting point is hundreds of yards, if not miles behind where another person's starting from? And so, with that, I do feel like, as times change, as the economic situation changes, as demographics change, it warrants any policy like that. There's a lot of social programs, especially, that, these things should be revisited. Are they meeting the original goals and objectives set forth? How are they working? I'm a data nerd, so longitudinally, like, what are the outcomes for people? All these things are things that I think about. But I mean, in terms of the policy as stated, as set forth, affirmative action was, attempting to address disparities in the education system. And I agree with that premise, which is that we're not all starting from the same place. Now, in terms of sort of maybe what people would consider the unintended consequences, again, this is not an area of policy that I'm going to go super deep on, but, people have feelings. It's nuanced. There are maybe some unintended consequences of it, and some people that are feeling like they're left out of the equation, that it only addresses it for certain people and not others. And you can be poor, and you can be underrepresented, and be any color, and all these, a whole list of other things. But I do think that overall, as a society, I think we should be always concerned with making sure that we are trying to address issues of systemic racism or inequality that make it harder for anyone to succeed. So I agree with the intentions and the spirit of that particular policy.
In another conversation I had with somebody, I think he called affirmative action as a band-aid, but that it doesn't necessarily ensure that you will have a better representation. You kind of like, yeah, you're acting like it in a way.
I mean, yeah, there's two. I mean, and I think you'll always find, obviously, the people that say it doesn't go far enough, and the people that don't think it has a place at all. And I think this is a little bit more of a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, maybe. But it was a start. It was a start, and I do think there are probably more steps we should be taking in places where, frankly, like, my concern with the education system is that we need probably interventions at every step along the way. But as it relates to particularly where you get the biggest bang for your buck, it's early education, right? It's years, a decade plus before people are even college age. And so in my opinion, the disparities in the educational system, honestly, at that point, some of these interventions are too late. And so this is where I'll go into being like the, social science nerd that I am, which is the fact that the quality of your education when you're young is primarily determined by the zip code that you live in. And if you're in a poor neighborhood, the education system is, you're stuck because of the fact that we've had, kind of systemic structural issues, and probably a legacy of disinvestment in particular communities tied back to property taxes, home values. So if you're living in a poor neighborhood and that money from property values and the taxes that you're paying, that's what's, one of the mechanisms of funding for schools. We all know that if you're in a poor neighborhood, you're screwed because the school system, you don't have enough resources for that. So in a lot of ways, again, I'm a big fan of Raj Chetty's work, but the fact that, again, where you're born today, literally your zip code is a major determinant in your outcomes in terms of your economic mobility. It's terrifying, and it's true, and it's a stark reality. So yeah, I mean, affirmative action is great. Like, assuming you can get to that place where you're college ready, that was what that intention of that was, right? So like, that was great. But there's more. We got to rethink everything. And again, I'm also a big housing policy is where I spend a lot of my time for fun, and previously a little bit professionally too. And so a lot of this comes down to the systems of lending and the systems of housing and the patterns of development in the country as well. So yeah, it's a tangled web we've woven here.
I think this leads us right to the next big topic, which is the topic of privilege. And that is a privilege that a lot of us may not even realize that we have. Before I go any deeper into that, how would you describe white privilege, and what do you see as white privilege?
I just would like to acknowledge that I think, the fact that white privilege has made it into a lexicon, and really, I think the last, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years. But it's something that I think, while we haven't always called it that, it's obviously existed for as long as all of us and beyond the time that we've been on this earth. But White privilege to me is really the recognition that, you, by virtue of, how you were born into this world, the color of your skin, may be a beneficiary of systems that are in place that, really allow you to, or give you greater opportunities to succeed in life. And so I think what's tough about white privilege, and I think this is one of those hard conversations to have with people, is people take offense. They say, well, I've worked hard, I've had these discussions with some friends, and thankfully most of my friends are woke, if you will, here in my circle. But I think people are, a lot of white people are offended by it, because in their mind it's something that implies that, they haven't worked for what they have. They haven't worked hard. They haven't earned it. Something was given to them. And it's not, white privilege isn't saying that you're not struggling. It's not saying that you're not poor. It's not saying that, you just live in this lap of luxury because you were born white. What white privilege, I think, is trying to address is the fact that if you, Daniel, and me, Kirby, start in the same place, with the same resources around us, and let's say we're in poverty, we're in abject poverty, you, just by virtue of being white, even if you're struggling, you will have a better chance at making it out of that situation and giving yourself a better life than me having been born black. So again, it's through no fault of your own. You didn't create it. You didn't make it happen. You didn't even influence it. All you did was, you were born. You came into this world, but you benefit from it. And that's really what white privilege is about. And that's where I feel like I'm seeing people just lose their mind when you start to talk about privilege, white privilege. It's just, that is a harder conversation than talking about and directly addressing racism. It's part of the system, but now putting that on someone else and saying, like, you're contributing, or you've contributed, or the system that you're born into is part of the problem, people take major offense to that. So, I sit back and I watch these little dust ups everywhere on social media, on the news, and here and there, and it's fascinating. But I definitely think it exists. I think most people do, and I think it's when people can drop, to be honest, when people can drop the, remove yourself from it, in the sense that, like, the way I didn't choose to be born black, you didn't choose to be born white, but just acknowledging that the system may be designed to, or better suited for you to benefit. That's what we're looking for, is for people to just recognize that. It's not to take blame. It's not for you to feel guilty about it, but it is for people to recognize. And when people say they want to be an ally, it's them understanding that we've got to start to chip away at that and sort of dismantle that system. But step one is getting people to acknowledge that it exists, and that is just like moving mountains right now. So
Thank you. This is very much how I view privilege as well. And it's like the topic I talked to Bill Pugh about. That's actually how a lot of these conversations started. Is that him and I were chatting about speeding tickets a few months back, and I told him that the last 3 or 4 speeding tickets I let off with a warning, and he said, "Oh, something like that would never happen to me." And then it hit me. Oh, okay. So that's what privilege is, just simply like, I didn't do anything wrong. I just went, 5 miles or to 10 miles over speed limit. And I got pulled over, and I had a very cordial and friendly conversation with the officer. The officer said, "All right, drive safely." And that was the end of it. But somebody else doesn't have the same experience on a consistent basis, because they're viewed like immediately with suspicion. And they may be asked to step out of the car and whatnot, right? And just a simple thing as that, or like walking into a store and not being immediately eyeballed on, where you go, like between the aisles and stuff, right? That's a privilege today.
yeah.
It shouldn't be a privilege. It doesn't have to be a privilege. And I don't want this to be a privilege, but today it is a privilege. And I like to live in the world where everybody has, so it's not a privilege anymore. Like, everybody's treated like they're decent human beings, right? If they haven't done anything, right? And we don't get into unnecessary tension and things like this. But yeah, I think you made a very good point about the way to look at the privilege, and
Yeah.
it's not about instilling guilt. It's just about acknowledging that it exists, and how do we get to the world where it's not a privilege anymore? It's just the way we treat each other.
Yeah, and I think, it's everyone's got their stories, and everyone's got, the first step is just recognizing that it exists. And you and I have talked before, and I have a lot of wonderful friends that have been very open and honest in these discussions, black, white, Mexican, from all places around, anywhere, really, not just the country, but internationally. And we're at a place where if people aren't willing to acknowledge the things that are happening, the current events that are right in front of them, then we're in a serious problem regardless. But to your point, the fact that privilege is that I've never, many speeding tickets as I've gotten, that's something, just the relationship between black people and the police. Thinking back to even when I first got my driver's license and have gotten speeding tickets along the way, like I've never tried to even attempted to, talk my way out of a speeding ticket. And I think it maybe once I got off with the warning because the cop was pretty nice, but for you to recognize that, your default might be like, oh, can I just smooth talk this officer and kind of get my way out, and which works for some people, but for other people, and you see it, in countless stories we're hearing right now, it's a life or death. A traffic stop can be a life or death situation for a black person, and it is. And so just even reaching for your ID and not making it out of that situation alive. And so, privilege in a lot of ways too, it's like you're speaking to different, it takes different shapes and forms across every aspect of our life. But, even just at parenting, and I don't have children, and I have many friends who do, but, just taking for granted small things that you're probably not going to think twice about your kid going outside to play, or your kid walking to the convenience store to get some candy, or your kid going to play a game of basketball not thinking that they're not going to make it home because someone thought they were being suspicious, or your kid going out for a run and
Yeah.
jogging and being followed. And so, like, these aren't, at this point, it's really about the right to survive and just about the right to exist. And the fact that that's a serious threat, and an issue that we're dealing with and confronting right now. Of course, it gets from there, extends to education, extends to access to education, the corporate world, what opportunities you have for opportunity and growth. But like at a basic, very fundamental level, people are just fighting for the right to live, and exist and survive, and have people not consider them a threat or a danger just because they're dark. And it's a scary thing.
It's interesting. So I was talking to Xavier Leonard, and he was saying, like, talking about encounters with police, and he was saying that, in like, for a black person, sometimes, oh, for him, encounters with black police were even worse
Yeah.
than with white cops.
Yep.
Like, have you had any encounters with like any unpleasant encounters with police that you thought that
Yeah.
the racial uh, race was involved?
Yeah, I can give you one, and it wasn't a violent exchange, but I think I've certainly experienced it and seen it, but I think that there's also on the shoulders of our law enforcement that happen to also be people of color. There's a burden that they carry, which is that they don't necessarily want to be seen as righteous or sympathetic to other people just because they look like them, and so maybe they're a little bit more heavy-handed in the way they interact with people. But I'll give you a great story. When I was in grad school in LA, this is really minor, and it's actually kind of funny just because of sort of how it played out. But
I thought you said it was uneventful.
yeah, I mean, there were a couple things, but
All right.
my husband, my boyfriend at the time, had come out to visit, and we were going to the little, I forget what you call it, but like the little like textile kind of district in LA, and they've kind of got like little outdoor market, a bunch of vendors selling a bunch of crap out of stalls that you don't need, shirts and CDs and everything. But it's right near Skid Row in LA. And so we had driven down there. I lived in Chinatown, so just kind of on the outskirts of downtown. And so we had driven through downtown to get to this area, and we parked in basically on the edge of Skid Row. And Skid Row, for context, it's got a lot of kind of the epicenter of kind of homelessness and drugs for downtown Los Angeles. And they've made progress. It's gotten a little bit better, but still a pretty rough area. And at that time in the late 2000s, it was pretty bad. So we had parked on this corner in Skid Row. And just for context, there were, as soon as we stepped out of the car, or getting out of the car, just a few yards from us, a couple guys smoking something out of a pipe. You could smell it, you could see it. There was a homeless person and lined, it's kind of like a tent city, just like tents of homeless people lined on that particular street. It's very, very rough and a lot of illicit activity. So on both corners that we were on, we're parked in the middle of this block. On both corners, I kid you not, there are people dealing drugs. And it's very, like, if you've been in a place where you see people dealing drugs, it's pretty easy to identify, and you see kind of these brief exchanges. So kind of aware of our surroundings, people passing money and kind of thief in the night, little encounters. And then we park, and there's a meter, so we have to feed the meter. So as we're getting out of the car, there's a homeless person that's approaching us, and he starts talking and saying, like, hey, if you give me your money, if you give me the coins you're going to put in this meter, I can take this paper clip and just kind of jiggle it and like get the time on the meter for you. So he wanted the money in exchange for just like putting time on the meter. And so I didn't want to deal with it. So it's a very small side street that we're on. And so my husband gets out of the car, then boyfriend, and we cross the street. Like, we cross in the middle of the street, and it's a very low traffic street. Not a lot of activity except for like pedestrian and illicit crime happening on the street, but very little cars. And there's a motorcycle cop who we failed to recognize as being there, but posted up, in this area, clearly seeing everything happening on this street, from the drug deals to the person smoking right here to this homeless person that's trying to game the system and like take our change. And we cross over this tiny little street to the other side of the street to walk safely to where we were headed. And he just zips out of this parking lot, like a block away, clearly had watched this whole thing, and pulls us over, stops us for jaywalking. And so I didn't know this at the time, but the cop gets off his bike, takes off his helmet, he's black, and he just takes a look at us, the two of us, and he kind of gives, people convey a lot of emotion, and you can kind of tell what's going on up here just by the way they look at you. Little concerned, looks at me, looks at my boyfriend at the time, again, pretty white looking dude, and it was just like, do you know why I pulled you over? I'm like, no, I don't. Please tell me. As I'm like, he's like, well, because you just jaywalked. And I'm like, okay. And I immediately, I'm furious, because I'm like, dude, you could not have picked me up and dropped me into a more sketchy looking block with everything going on around me. And like, you came over here to pull us over for jaywalking in like the most unsafe block in the city of Los Angeles. But it was a really small interaction, but it sat with me for so long, similar to my experiences in New Orleans with my husband too, where it's like, he didn't even just have a problem with me. This was a direct, probably criticism of the relationship that I was in, where it's like, he saw that, these two young kids, and like the whole interaction, from the way taking my ID, taking his ID, giving us like the, what's your relationship, that whole spiel, which shouldn't have even mattered for a jaywalking ticket, what my relationship was to this other human being. But like, it was demeaning, and demoralizing in that moment, also infuriating, because I'm like, at some point I said directly, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Like, I'm watching people deal drugs on this corner, and like, you're pulling me over for jaywalking. So, that it's just a small example, but it happens. And I think, in that place, he was also black. So I'm like, what's your end game here? Are you also is this a quota issue? Because I feel like the bigger bang for your buck is like doing something about the drug dealing, but like, you want to give me this ticket. So I don't know.
How did it end?
I got a ticket and we had to pay it. They were $174 a piece.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it was
Crazy,
wild. So,
crazy. Yeah.
it is what it is. But
Well, if that was the biggest encounter you had in LA, things weren't so bad.
I mean, like I said, my biggest police
Yeah.
encounter, LA
Yeah.
was a different beast, but I never really had, again, grad school is a little bit different. It's kind of
Yeah.
like a little bubble, a safe little bubble that you're in there. So
All right. Well, let's talk a little about what do you think people may be not getting or not understanding about race and what's going on and what needs to change.
I think we kind of hit the high points of it, but I think we're at a place. What needs to change is that people really need to understand the systems and the society into which they were born. So a few moments ago, we talked about privilege and what it means to what white privilege means for us today. And so, I think for a lot of people, maybe an older generation, they thought, like, what more could you ask for? You've got the right to vote. You've got the right to, go to the schools that you want to, and we don't have to be segregated anymore. And they think that the civil rights movement was just a flash, and all of a sudden people have gotten everything that they need, and like race relations are repaired, and we're in a better place. And it's not that simple. And we're fighting. Maybe we're not fighting for the right to vote, or we're not fighting for the right to, occupy the same space as people that look differently than us. We've won those in some regards, but the fact of the matter is, people that look like me largely are still not thriving in this country because we haven't tackled the really hard work of, I think, dismantling these legacy systems that are not benefiting everybody. And so I think, to your point, we're moving to this place where for meaningful change to happen, everyone has to be engaged. It can't just be the people that look like me. It can't just be the black people, the black population in this country, or any minority group. Whether it's LGBTQ fighting for equality, whether it's black people, whether it's immigrants. You need allies. You need the people that are in positions of power. You need the people that don't look like you to also care, because I think that's the only way that we're going to move the needle. And so what I feel like I'm seeing a lot of right now is, a lot of, I would say, the nice way to put it is sort of apathy. There's, people aren't as inclined to care about things that don't affect them directly, is what I'm seeing. So it's like, well, that's not an issue that I need to worry about because it doesn't affect me. And this is playing out across the country. The national rhetoric and landscape is very, very dark and very dangerous and very divided right now. But at the core of it, I just think that if we want to make meaningful change, we've got to rally around each other and support one another. And I recognize, and you recognize, that at the end of the day, we want the same things: economic security. You want to make sure that your basic needs are met, and then once you've made sure that you have food, you have housing, all of those things, you want to be able to thrive and feel like you're getting ahead. I want to make sure that my family's safe. I want to make sure that I have access to healthcare. And so I think, recognizing that, again, not to sound too cliche, but the reality of it is we are really, truly more similar than we are different. And for better or for worse, we all occupy the same planet. And so my concern, and for where we're at, is just that we need more people, again, black, white, purple, orange, yellow. Everyone's got to realize that, we will be better as a society when everybody is truly, truly given the opportunity to succeed and to thrive. And so we need more people to care about the small things, from, to your point, just, confronting whatever, some of us may have some deeply held prejudices or biases that are a little bit subconscious, right? You grew up in a system where, no one can blame you, I guess, if, you happen to see someone, let's say it's dark outside and you see a shadowy figure and that person happens to be black. Like, you have to start to confront that type of thinking. And I think we all have kind of bias like that in some way or some form, but then it's bigger. So it's like, one, confronting the way you interact with people directly, how you perceive someone just based off of what you see in front of you. So the stereotypes and the systems that mental systems you may adhere to. But then the bigger piece of it is, what does society, what structures are in place that may be benefiting me, that maybe not, they're not having the same effect for other people, and is that fair? And what can I do about that? So I feel like there are a lot of, really good people out there. I like to think by default, most people are inherently good. I have to hold on to that, because if not, I feel like I will fall apart if I think that people are bad. But, again, it's very simple. We need more people to get in the game and play the game. Even if they're not Black, even if they're not an immigrant, even if they're not some other marginalized community that's fighting for change, we need everyone to understand that change is good for all of us and it's necessary. Otherwise, we're going to keep bumping up against the problems that we've got right now. And nobody wants to see those protests out on the street. Nobody wants to, see this horrific, traumatizing videos of people being, subject to police brutality, not escaping these really basic, mundane interactions with law enforcement just because they're Black and perceived as a threat. Like, I don't know. I don't want to know the people who think that that's okay. And if you're a person who doesn't think that's okay, then right there, you've identified yourself as someone that has a duty to change the world around you. So I think that's where I'm at, is that we all play a role in this, whether we like it or not.
I very much agree with that. I think we might be robbing ourselves of talent, robbing ourselves of friendship, robbing ourselves of a lot of other things if we don't recognize that and if we don't do anything about that. So we covered a lot of ground. We talked about quite a few things.
Yeah.
And so what do you think we haven't talked about? There's anything that we didn't even touch that we should have talked about?
I don't know. I feel like we hit, all the pressing things, but I'm just thinking about some of the recent conversations I've been having with friends, having with loved ones, recognizing, experiencing and feeling a lot of pain, seeing a lot of pain and destruction around me as well. And, in response to, rightfully so, the anger, the frustration, and the current events. I get that. I get it on a personal, on a cellular level. What we're experiencing as a Black person in America. And I think one thing that we haven't talked about is, tangible or actionable next steps for people. And I'll bring this back to my direct experience in San Diego, which is, again, I think, I very much love this city. I very much love the West Coast. I think, I have no desire to really live anywhere else. But again, I also know from my personal experience that, racism takes many forms. And in a place like San Diego and in places that are a little bit more liberal or tolerant, if you will, like the West Coast, you don't really have to dig deep. You can kind of scratch the surface. I think people may be more polite, a little bit more diplomatic. It's not outward displays of hatred or, racism or what have you. But for my friends that are asking what they can do here, particularly, I'm telling them that they should be talking to their loved ones and just opening up these discussions about race in a really meaningful way, and recognizing that sometimes it's open-ended. You don't have the right words. You don't even have the right questions, but just being able to have a dialogue with, especially, parents, colleagues, folks around you. It's the best chance we have is influencing the people that are already in our networks. And sometimes, I guess what I'm saying is, you don't always know how people feel deep down inside. People probably know the things that they should or should not say publicly. Some people don't, which is why social media is so tough. They say everything. But, just by having honest conversations with people around you, you may make people feel differently or consider a situation or consider their circumstances differently. When we talk about things like privilege, having an honest discussion with someone, even relating it back to your own experience of what white privilege has looked like for you, I think it makes it a little less uncomfortable. A little less uncomfortable. But then it also allows people to kind of maybe pick up on something and identify ways that they can start to challenge their mindset or challenge the way that they're interacting with with their environment and society. So it's really simple. Have some conversations with people that you love. Sometimes people harbor prejudices and biases that they're not even aware of. And I think the best opportunity we have is to start talking to people closest to us, because those are the people that you can influence. I really worry about, people spending so much time and effort trying to break down the people, the furthest, most extreme people on the other side, because those people aren't listening to you. Those people are speaking and shouting and screaming into their own echo chamber. And that happens on the left, it happens on the right. And I feel like there's a whole lot of people that are maybe moderate, sort of more, there's more middle ground there. Those are the conversations and the people that we should be engaging, because the people that are always screaming the loudest on both extremes, you just hope that they're talking to a smaller subset of people, but your time and efforts are not best spent trying to confront those people. It's talking to the people that that may just have a little bit difference of an opinion than you, but that probably would benefit from having some honest discussions, and maybe they'll see their world in a little bit different light after you've talked to them about some of these issues. So.
Thanks, Kirby. And I think that's exactly what people need to hear. And the whole idea is to have these conversations heard. The more people, the better. And then I think it will help a lot of people realize what's really happening, what's going on, maybe develop some more compassion, and that will drive the change and drive the actions that are going to go on top of this. I realize we kind of hitting our time mark.
Yeah.
And it's a great conversation. I think we could have kept going for a while, but I'm going to stop